Welcome to this episode of The People Dividend. I'm your host, Mike Horn, and I am absolutely delighted to have in our virtual studio today Al Watts. And I'm delighted in several regards. One, because he is a connection of a dear friend. But beyond that, Al brings 30 or more years of experience as an independent consultant, helping leaders and organizations succeed by aligning people, systems, and strategy. He is particularly skilled at helping clients define strategic direction, identifying barriers to achieving goals, and helping boards, executive teams, and diverse stakeholder groups craft shared commitments for growth. He facilitates experiences for groups that range in size from teams of 2 to over 100 participants to establish common ground, agree on direction, and solve problems together. Let me just add a little more about Al. He previously served in HR and talent development leadership roles for 3 corporations, was the charter president of the HR Executive Forum, and president of Twin Cities ASTD. So maybe you can guess where he's from, or made home, or makes home. And he's the author of Navigating Integrity, Transforming Business as Usual into Business at Its Best. He has, over the course of his career, been a frequent presenter and facilitator for professional associations and conferences. He has an undergraduate degree in business psychology and communication from the University of Minnesota, and his master's in organization development from Bowling Green State University in Ohio, one of the leading OD schools. And he's been an adjunct professor teaching strategic management for Metropolitan State University. He and his wife, Carly, are Minneapolis residents. When he can, Al enjoys sailing Lake Superior and someplace where I've always wanted to go, Minnesota's Boundary Waters canoe area. So I'm really happy to have Al with us in the studio. Al, can you say a few words about yourself, please?
Sure. I don't know what else I want to say. That all sounded pretty good to me.
You'll take it, right?
Yeah. But as you read that, it reminded me of a thought I wanted to share at the outset here. I ran into one of my favorite quotes from Kierkegaard the other day, and I absolutely love it. He talks about how life can be best understood backwards, but must be lived forward. And I'm going to use that as a springboard for what we'll talk about later. If I can just spend a few minutes laying some groundwork for that.
That'd be great. It always reminds me, that Kierkegaard quote always reminds me of something about leadership and how, it's about taking us, stepping backwards, but not taking a step back. I always like that play on words. Al's also the author of Navigating Integrity, Transforming Business as Usual into Business at Its Best. And for many of those in our audience who were fans of my last book, Integrity by Design, Working and Living Authentically, today's conversation should really resonate. What Al went on to do with that book is he created the Leadership Integrity Survey and the Organizational Integrity Survey. So let's start there, Al. I mean, why that topic? Why the topic of integrity?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And just going back to that Kierkegaard quote in terms of life being better understood backwards, and I think that applies to careers as well. I still remember, as a double major at the University of Minnesota in business and psychology, walking across a bridge over the Mississippi River that connected the business school with the rest of the university. So all the psychology courses, sociology courses, diversity, equity, whatever, were on the East Bank, and all the business classes, economics, marketing, accounting, and so forth, were on the West Bank. And I talk about this in the introduction to the book, because that was my first realization decades later that a river still runs through it. In other words, there was a divide between the business campus and the rest of what was important on the East Bank in terms of the people factor, psychology, human stuff, just as there is in business today. And I guess I would say organizations broadly.
Yeah, so interesting. I had a similar story or experience in that regard. Like you, I worked in a few big corporations, corporations of enormous size, and uh, in most of my work, I worked in executive development, organization development, and I often interacted with thought leaders from the top business schools in the United States and in Europe, INSEAD in particular. And there was at the latter stages of my career, I got very involved in Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy's work on immunity to change, and Bob's pivotal book, seminal book, The Evolving Self. So I went to study with Bob and Lisa at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and um, that same divide existed. I could be with a thought leader in this world of personal development and personal growth, and think about what folks on that side of the campus would charge for corporate consultation versus their peers on the other side of the campus at the business school, and it was quite a shocker. But I experienced that as well. So tell me a little bit about your career and how you ended up in organization development and chose the path that you did.
Sure. Well, organization development, I think part of why, again, going back to how this all makes more sense as you reflect on the early years, but organization development seemed to be a discipline, with a focus on the people factor, but that took a more holistic perspective on business and on organizations and on how to make them work and be sustainable. So that's how I gravitated to organization development while I was still working for that first of the three organizations. And then I finished the organization development degree and, practiced that as I could. And over the years, both inside organizations and as a consultant, I continued to see disconnects. It goes back to that bridge between, pure business, if you will, all about profitability, all about market share, all about revenue, and the rest of what's important. So that got my wheels turning in terms of, well, how do we take a broader perspective on that? And then looking up integrity in the dictionary, Webster's dictionary, the first, and by the way, marketing my services under the banner of integrity is kind of a hard sell.
Yeah,
Because
sure
people are
is.
saying, oh, yeah, we've got that. We're ethical. We're moral. Well, that speaks to Webster's first definition. But the second definition is all about being whole, being complete, being sound. Translate that to an organizational perspective, I would say sustainable. And as I reflected on my practice inside and outside organizations, I said, you know what? I don't think we're looking at this big picture enough, holistically, if you will. And I asked myself the question, okay, so what does it take to not only be effective in the business world? Of course, that's measured by revenue, market share, profitability, things like that, and also engaging. And this is where I think you and I, among the other things we have in common, might connect around the people dividend. We
Right.
need to focus on the people aspect of the business. And not only that, but especially today, as you look at what's happening in the environment, you look at what's happening in terms of the stories of some of the products being manufactured, they also need to be ethical. And I hesitated with that third E, if you will, and you'll hear me talk about triple E organizations. If we want whole organizations, we want whole leaders, those are triple E organizations and leaders. Yes, they're effective. They're also engaging. That's the people factor. And they're ethical. And I'll chat a bit more about this later, but the ethical piece has to do with not just being honest, legal, et cetera, et cetera. It also means being effective stewards in the broad sense of the term. And I guess all consultants need to have a model, but that's how I built that idea around organizational and leadership integrity. And one more thing before we ask a couple more questions, and I like the way you're doing this, by the way, in terms of the question and answer format. I thought, okay, since I spent a fair amount of time as you, Mike, in terms of talent and leadership development, and since I'm a sailor, I thought, oh, no, if we want to go from point A to point B across Lake Superior or any big body of water, we need to make sure we have a sound boat organization and a sound captain, competent captain. And so in my book, I talk about 4 dimensions of integrity as they apply to both organizations and their leaders.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to explore those 4 dimensions. And I often think, like you, that integrity is of whole cloth. From a structural engineer's point of view, it's when everything hangs together. And
Yes.
I come to think about it in some ways on a personal level as having congruency between, what I say and what I do, and hopefully with what I think, because some people are good at doing what they're told, I've noticed. But this congruency, and what it does, at least Al, what I've experienced and what I've seen in executives around the world, is that congruency produces a certain kind of happiness that is often in short supply among executives. And I think you know as well as I do that, what research tells us is that people enjoy being around happy people. And I don't mean the kind of happiness that comes with a new boyfriend or girlfriend or a great quarter, but I mean a level of sustained happiness that yields some big dividends, maybe these people dividends. I was often floored when I worked in one of these big corporations by an executive who said to me, Mike, if we could figure out a way to make money without people, we would. And I thought, there's really no way to do that. So I'm curious about your four E's and what they mean.
Yeah, thanks. Lots of stuff to talk about here.
Or your 4 dimensions.
Briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 4 dimensions. The 3 E's are effectiveness, engagement, and ethical.
Right.
But the 4 dimensions start with identity. And from my perspective, identity is at the foundation of integrity. So as you talk about congruence, and I really identify with that term, Mike, well, it's congruence with what? And whether we're talking about organizations, whether we're talking about leaders, what I focus on at the foundation are what I call 3 P's: purpose, principles, or some might call them values, and priorities. And very, very briefly about those, and some of your listeners might be acquainted with Richard Leiter, who wrote a fabulous book on the power of purpose many years ago. He and I have stayed connected, and I'm a great believer in the power of purpose. And purpose, talk about people being happy. People are happy when they feel like they're working for a purpose or with a purpose that is meaningful to them. And there's lots we could talk about around just the purpose piece. The principles are, some would call them values. And we see organizations, most organizations have their list of principles or values up on the wall, but far fewer of them are clear over and over again about what those principles mean in terms of what the organization will or will not do. And the 3rd P for identity is priorities, as in strategic priorities. What direction are we headed? Why? And what are our operational and strategic priorities? You look at the surveys yourself, on average, 60% of employees in any organization you're talking about do not know what the strategic priorities are.
Sure.
So the foundation is identity. The 2nd dimension, I'll run through these briefly and then fire away with questions when I'm done. Yeah. But the 2nd dimension is authenticity. And I take a little different take on that. I talk about both inside out authenticity. That's where much of the congruence you're talking about lies, Mike. Also, outside in authenticity. And the outside in authenticity is looking at what's real in the marketplace, for example, or in terms of how the world is changing. And of course, I have 3 T's for authenticity. I talk about trueness. That's like your congruency, trueness to purpose, principles, and priorities. truth-telling in organizations, and transparency. More on that later, perhaps. Now, the third dimension is alignment. And I talk about both alignment, the noun, as in, let's make sure that remember McKinsey's 7S model? He
Sure.
talked about strategy, structure, staff, systems. Organizationally, I'm sure you've encountered this as well. You find pay systems that really aren't paying for what the organization has stated its priorities or its principles are. Or you find there needing to be a different mix of staff because it's not quite a fit with where the organization's headed. But I also talk about aligning the verb. Organizations and leaders cannot keep doing the same thing they've been doing exactly the same as the world changes. And so there need to be mechanisms in place to constantly readjust things like structure, for example, or skill mixes. And last but not least, the fourth dimension is accountability. And that's, as in the Oz principle, if you remember that, old-fashioned responsibility instead of just doing what we say we're going to do and taking responsibility for solving problems. That's also where the stewardship comes in, though, in terms of taking that broader perspective and being an effective steward. So in a nutshell, those are the four dimensions.
It's interesting, the dimensions: identity, authenticity, alignment, accountability, if I have that right.
Yep.
And, I reflect then on these three Ps as well: purpose, principles, and priorities. Purpose helps us to answer the why, right? It's
absolutely.
And principles, of course, values might be interchangeable in that way. And then priorities. I wonder about, I'm going to mix some things here, that it used to be, and I assume it's still true, that one of the values that's common among many corporations, at least those who have value statements, is integrity. I mean, actually, the three most common, from what I understand, were passion, integrity, and courage. Three most commonly found values in organizations. And, as we might speculate, they're often more on the walls and not in the halls. And people, it's no wonder, I mean, to your point, that people don't understand them. They're not sure of them. It's no wonder why we have an engagement crisis in most organizations. So how do you go about, waking this up in leaders and executives and creating perhaps a renaissance, a revolution, some kind of newness in the organization where engagement isn't taken for granted?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And one of my concerns now, Mike, is that things are happening at such a rapid pace and they're changing so quickly in the marketplace and technologically that I think executives or any leader for that matter kind of have their hands full just treading water, if you will, getting things done. And in another setting where I did this sort of a thing, I asked the question of the speaker how we could achieve what he'd been talking about. And he said, we just need to get better and quicker at it. I don't know if I know that's not the whole answer. Also, by the way, in the book, I talk about the importance of courage for any of this stuff. And in that context of purpose and principles, it takes courage, I think, especially for a CEO or a board or a leader in any unit or organization, to step back enough. And he or she really needs to believe what we're talking about here. And by the way, they can look at some of the research, because research has been done, as you've referenced, in terms of the value of engagement, which includes having shared values and consistency or congruence with those values, they have to look at the research that's been done. If you want to engage your employees and you want to keep them and you want them to not just be punching the clock, then you do need to have a meaningful purpose and you need to mean what you say in terms of your principles and make sure that people understand those. And you need to hire people who are in sync with those, and you need to fire people who aren't. I don't know if that answers your question, but
well, yeah,
I think the first piece is just awareness. The first piece is just awareness, and that's why I wrote the book. I think that's why you're doing what you do, and that is to drill the point home, citing research if that's useful in terms of the real power that has when it's done authentically.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, Al, that it seems to me that the speed of messaging, the speed of communication, the speed of what we used to call, I don't know, the grapevine. It wasn't the grapevine, but the rumor mill has increased dramatically. You know, I remember the time when we would spend a week crafting an organization message after a strategy retreat or some particularly important offsite. And I'm working with a client right now where it's taken them about 2 weeks to get some messaging straight. And while that time is already well spent, the story has been told.
Yeah.
I wonder,
if people don't know what's going on, they'll make stuff up.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Hallucination's powerful in that regard. And I mean, how do you think we begin to, account for speed on the topic of integrity? I think you and I both know that once it's law, if I don't think you have integrity, I won't trust you. And if I don't trust you, I probably don't think you have integrity. And that once lost or once the trust is eliminated, it's difficult to recover. It's difficult to regain. Any comments on that or thoughts on that in terms of speed and acceleration?
Well, thanks for that. And just going back to the accountability dimension, I make a point in the book about how we need to count what counts.
Right.
And so in my work with clients, when they engage me, or if they read the book and they think, well, this is pretty cool, we'd like some of this. That's where the organizational integrity survey comes in. And by the way, there are examples of what that survey consists of on my website. If people dig around a little bit, look at the survey section. So I think step one is awareness and agreement among an executive team that yes, integrity as defined in the book in those 4 dimensions are important. The next is, well, if we have the courage to ask the questions, let's see how we're doing. And if they find out via the survey, which is customizable, by the way, that they're not getting the word out. Well, first of all, that people don't have a clear idea of what strategic priorities are, or that they're not getting the word out quickly enough, or that there isn't enough transparency in the organization. That's where I kind of come in, working with the executive team, asking the same question that you just did. There's a disconnect here. There's a gap between where we want to be around communication of our principles and priorities, for example, and where we are. So, gang, how are we going to fix that? And then we get into we do the problem solving as an executive team. So I think the first step is agree that these things are important. If they're important, measure what matters, count what counts, have the courage to look at the results. And by the way, communicate the results as you would in any type of attitude survey, and get to work at fixing the gaps.
Yeah, I don't think there are any shortcuts to leadership today, or if they ever existed. What many of my clients in the C-suite tell me, I'm always chagrined when I hear this, is that their days go downhill. They rarely go uphill. It's challenges, it's problems, it's people issues, it's all that sort of stuff that makes a day go downhill. And yet, I think if you have some of, the 3 T's you talked about, about truth telling and transparency and timeliness. Was it timeliness as the first?
Um, uh, Trueness is the first one. That's your congruency. Yeah, the trueness, and then truth telling and transparency.
Yeah, it certainly makes it a lot easier. Yeah.
Timeliness would be a great fourth T.
Yeah. Well, it certainly makes it a lot easier, right? I mean, to act out of, out of authenticity and trueness. To act out of those three T's: trueness, truth telling, and transparency, doesn't it?
Sure, and just going back to the timeliness piece, and how do you deal with days going downhill and the urgency, but never enough time to do stuff? I think one application of transparency is, even if an executive team doesn't have the answer yet, or for whatever reason the communication they want hasn't come out, being transparent about that and why that's the case. So it's in my book, that's a part of transparency is leaders and organizations just being more open around, hey, we don't have the answer to that yet. We haven't figured it out. Stay tuned. Ask me whatever questions you have and I'll try to answer them. And this is where not social media, but where whatever internal communications mechanisms the organization has for asking and answering questions can come in to keep people apprised of what's happening real time.
I've often been asked in some seminars on integrity, is it okay to tell a small lie? And I always get a big laugh out of that question because what I think is, well, number one, why are you asking me? I can't really, I'm not your rabbi. I'm not your priest. I'm not your confessor.
Counselor,
I can't give you an answer on that. But what I can tell you is that, it does diminish trust when you lie. And trust, I think, is at the cornerstone of most authentic relationships and certainly at the core of authentic leadership.
Absolutely. It's also at the on the cornerstone of performance and sustainability and engagement of employees. I get that question a lot as well, and I do address it in the book. And from my perspective, and by the way, I think that it is appropriate at times to tell small lies. It depends on our motivation and why we're telling the lie. It sort of goes back to Stephen Carter wrote a book a while back on leadership integrity. I forget the exact title of it, but it was very good. And I remember in his workshop, someone asking the question, is it ever okay to break the law and or violate the law? And his answer was, it depends on your motivation and why you're doing it, and if you're willing to accept the consequences of breaking the law. It sort of goes back to civil disobedience, I suppose.
Yeah.
But if our motivation in telling a white lie is to escape from telling the truth, or how it might come back to hurt us in some capacity, or to conceal something for our gain, no, it's not okay. But, people are all different. And if we're going to hurt someone, and this is where discernment, but I hate to keep coming up with these 3 P's and 3 T's and three C's and so on and so forth. But in addition to courage, one of the 3 C's toward the end of the book, I talk about the 3 D's. And one of the 3 D's is discernment. And discernment is that old, and what you've talked about, the importance of leaders reflecting, Mike. And I think that reflection is a part of discernment. We need to know our own minds, and we need to have the capacity to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and if there are better ways to operate than we are. It's an old-fashioned discipline, so to speak, but discernment is that thinking process or that reflective process where we can say, okay, I'm going to tell a lie here. Is this for my benefit or for the greater good? And thinking through the consequences of that. Okay, so I'm going to tell this little lie, and then somebody calls me on it. What am I going to do? What will I say? Why am I telling this lie? So it depends on the motivation, I think, and our ability to exercise discernment.
Well, I think what discernment does, at least for me, it helps me figure out what's work and what's not work. It's an ability to sort of bifurcate things. And maybe that's another way of thinking about what's in self-interest versus what's in service. And I don't think, usually don't go wrong if you're choosing service over self-interest. People, all of our listeners, and we'll have this in the show notes, can find out more about Al Watts at integro-inc.com, INTEGRO Inc.com, where you'll be able to find out more about Al Watts and the work that he's done in terms of navigating integrity and transforming businesses. Al, if you were, offering some guidance, I'm going to hesitate to use this word, some advice to developing leaders about the exercise or the navigation of integrity, what would those pieces of advice or guidance be?
That's a great question. One is, I hate to keep going back to my model, but one would be to be clear in their own minds about what their own purpose is, their own principles, and their priorities. Because first, those need to be congruent with the organizations or whatever team they're a part of. And my advice follows right through the rest of those dimensions. I suggest they think about the degree that they're congruent with that purpose, those values or principles they have, and priorities. Are they telling the truth? And if they're not, why is that? Is that for their own benefit or for the broader good? I'd ask them if they had influence around things like pay in their organization and how that works, how individuals are selected, who's hired, who's not hired, and mix on the team, making sure that things like staffing and pay and structure are aligned with what they want to get done and how they want to do it. And I would ask them to reflect on the degree that that there's accountability in their organization or in their team. Are they counting the things that count? So, hope that answers your question, but I'm a little biased. I'd probably give them that advice because it reflects my experience after a few decades doing this.
Well, and I'd like to wrap up maybe with just one other line of inquiry, one other question, which is, I think the language that you use around shared commitments, common ground, what are the barriers to achieving that today? I mean, in a nutshell, around creating common ground, around creating shared commitment. In the executive teams that you've experienced, any highlights there in terms of the barriers for those?
Several come to mind. Some are external and sort of outside of our control, and some are internal. Those outside of control are things like buyouts, mergers and acquisitions, the speed that everything happens, as we've talked about before. Maybe there are some ways we can manage that, but we sure haven't got much control over it. And internally, I think some of the barriers are insufficient discernment. A second D, by the way, is dialogue. Whole chapter on that in terms of, do we have the capacity to engage a diversity of employees, especially when there's disagreement, and to do that quickly for finding the right answer? Developing that kind of capacity for both discernment and dialogue in organizations, and not following that advice that I provided earlier, including assessing not only where they're at as leaders, but assessing where their organization is at in terms of that kind of integrity. Hope that's helpful.
It is. And it's been great to be in conversation today with Al Watts, the author of Navigating Integrity, Transforming Business as Usual into Business at Its Best, which you can find on Amazon. And you can certainly learn more about Al Watts and his work at integro-inc.com. Al Watts, it's been an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you today. So thank you.
Mike, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll look forward to following you beyond this.
And until the next episode of The People Dividend, stay well.